All right. So what did we get going on the website this week? I wrapped up the rendering tests.
Yeah. So EmberMap, we've been making 2 videos a week for about 3 weeks now, and I think this will be 4th week. I think if we do this.
Nice.
So we talked about doing 2 episodes a week and a podcast, and we're trying to stick to that. And I think we should eventually, if we can do it long enough, we're just going to say that's basically the product that we sell.
Yep.
That's like the subscription service.
Yep.
And there's something nice about those constraints.
Yep.
Yeah. So this week, you're going to put a button in the rendering test series for a little bit. You wrapped up with some Ember concurrency tasks. I feel like every time we talk about testing, it always sometimes comes back to like async stuff because it's just hard.
It's the hardest part of the test. Yeah.
But I really like the video this week. It's exactly the kind of thing that if you didn't carve out time for it to teach it, it's like maybe you could probably open up EmberMap's code base and there's places where that would be great and we just didn't do it because you're just working on it. And
yeah, I think I even say that at one point in the video. Like sometimes when I'm writing these async tests, it's just like throw a bunch of code in the test, get it working, but then at the end, ideally I want to come back and button this up and make it reusable.
Right.
And I think what I ended up with wasn't this giant abstraction. I think it's like it's a helper that's 5 lines.
Right.
And it gives you a great way to test tasks in your tests.
Right.
So
So that was the rendering test series, and the rendering test series is about an hour.
Yeah, I think it's a little under an hour.
And we ended up focusing on, you ended up focusing on like UI components from like a style guide, basically.
Yeah, the first part is kind of showing some of the new APIs in Ember 3 rendering tests, QUnit DOM, and the second half is going in and like testing a component, a button component that's used in various situations, and just some tips about how I approach this.
Right.
I really like this series.
Yeah,
I love
too.
the rendering tests.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
And then tomorrow we're gonna come out with it's gonna be like video 5 of the Functional CSS series, which, like a lot of our series now are more broad because we're trying to make it just like us coding things. So in the Functional CSS series, we're coding a Slack clone. So if you're building a Slack clone, inevitably you're gonna come across all sorts of challenges. And so the focus is on the design and the UI, and it's how to integrate functional CSS with Ember in a good way. But, in the episode that's going to come out tomorrow, we made a new link to helper because Ember's link to helper, when it works and solves your use case, is great, but it doesn't decompose into more powerful primitives that you can compose with your UI. And so I think in the future it will. But the router service that landed in Ember recently is like a big step forward for that. So we probably have this component in every one of our apps. And if you looked over the last 2 years, it's going to be, the oldest one is going to look completely ridiculous. The template, because if you think about the hardest part of the link to helper is the argument signature, which is a multiple arity. It's a multiple arity function, which means the argument list can vary in terms of its length. And so the first parameter is the route name. The way the official one works also is like it can take a label if you don't pass it a block. But let's just say you're passing it a block, so the label is the children. It takes the route name, and then it takes like model 1 to model n, and then it takes options. And so, the oldest version of this, and our template would be like if model 1,
if model 2,
if model 2,
if model 3.
And then if you try to pass 4 models, you're just like, it's not going to work. So that's pretty bad.
You got like an error. Sorry, we don't build apps with 4 models.
Yeah, exactly. No, never 4 dynamic segments in our URLs. But that's obviously pretty silly. And like just the code is so complicated.
I mean, when we built this very first link to, like, did we even have a routing service?
No.
Were we like going in and finding the private router? And
we were like calling transition to, and then for the href, I don't even know what we were doing for the href. We might have actually just been rendering link to and doing our own wrapping. Mm-hmm. So because you couldn't splat the arguments in the template. So you couldn't just do link to and then like in handlebars do like ... args. So we had to say if model 1, you're going to call link to with model 1 and route name. If you have 2 models, you're going to do pass model 1 and model 2. But if you passed model 2 and it was null, then link 2 would blow up. That was the problem. So you had to, the way you invoke Ember's link to would change. based on whether or not model 2 was defined.
I see. You're right. That's where you need the if statement.
Exactly.
Oh my God, this is like...
It's brutal. So like obviously if you could splat here, it would be great, but you couldn't. And there was no reasonable way to do this in JavaScript because link to is just a component. It's just packaged as a component. Now you could subclass link to, but that had its own issues. And really what you wanted is just something more flexible.
You want the you said this, the decomposable bits. You
right.
want to say like, the URL for and the active class.
Exactly.
And all that stuff.
So now that we have the routing service, it's super easy to make a renderless component that basically delegates all of that stuff to the routing service. And so you can call it exactly the same way you call the official link to helper, but you can make it so it doesn't render anything. It yields out one hash, and you can use link.href and link.transition to for the href part and the transition to the action part of a tag. And then you can use link.isActive, and you can use that, not only to control the classes on the anchor tag, but also to control any conditional logic you want to do in the block.
Nice.
Which is awesome because that's the part where you're like, I have a link to and I have an active class, but now down here I want to do something based on whether this is active.
Hey, it's like the contextual component link to.
Exactly.
Nice.
So that's awesome. That's like a great pattern, and super happy with that. So we ended up doing that in this. It's like episode 5 of the Tailwind course, which will come out tomorrow, and that helped us build like the workspace selector. So
Very cool.
Pretty cool. So yeah, that's what's new. And I think next week we'll probably start some new stuff, talking about doing some forums, videos, asking some folks what they want to see. And I want to do like, I was telling you about this earlier, I want to do like a mini series that I can just make when I feel like changing it up and just build like game UIs in Ember. It's like I've been playing God of War, which is sweet. And just the UIs in games these days are just amazing, and we just don't really apply that level of like a lot of times that level of creativity in our web apps.
I feel like if you made a game and you didn't have like animations or transition animations, what's animated transitions?
Yeah.
What am I looking for? You know what I'm talking
about?
Yeah,
animations. Yeah.
It would feel empty. It would feel like something was wrong.
Yeah, you don't have a seat at the table if you didn't have that stuff.
Yeah.
But even the menus for like the statistics in Overwatch, you're hovering things, everything's moving, which is, by the way, like we've been trying to do that more and more in our apps. And when you use it, like the consulting project we're working on, you just sit there and look at it and like things kind of fade in and fade out and move and just a little bit, but it helps a lot. It's the spatial part of our brain that helps track where you are. You don't feel like things just flick in and out and completely disappear. So I think it's important to learn that stuff and be able to do it in like a subtle way. So
awesome.
I think that'd be like a fun series to just...
I would love to watch you just code animations. So, yeah, I think that'd be really cool.
Nice. We had a little conversation earlier this week about... We ran into this issue again with store forking and draftable models and the different options there. And it's because we were talking about Apollo and we were learning a little bit about that. We were talking with some folks about that, and I heard on a podcast. And they have some APIs built into Apollo, and they have the same idea as Ember Data where you have like a cache on the client. And that cache can be used in the same way like a Redux store could be used as like the single source of truth. And that's how we think about Ember Data. Mm-hmm. But I think they have a really nice API built into Apollo for optimistic UI or pessimistic UI. And that's one of the things with Ember Data, the way it works, where it either is extremely useful in its default behavior or it's hard to work around. And so the fact that there's like one canonical, user ID 1 in the store, you change it changes everywhere. Again, like if you're pushing data from the server into your store and your interface updates, that's amazing because that's what you want. You don't have to deal with that problem. But if you're rendering a form and changing it, you don't necessarily want to do that because it represents something different than the server model at that point.
Right. I think the example that came up this week was we had a modal that opened like basically a form to edit a model's relationship, but behind it, you had the
list,
the overlay with a list, and you start editing this form, and all of a sudden the page behind you just starts jumping around.
Right, exactly.
And it's like, okay, I think this is tough because it's like one of those things, there's a million ways to solve this. You
Right.
can do like local component props, you can do change set.
Right.
You can do like what we've done in the past, like draftables.
Right.
So yeah, I just think there's a lot of options here.
Yeah, a lot of options. And also, yeah, it spills out in a lot of ways too, where you're rendering the list and filtering by like ID or is new false, so that when you create new client-side records, they don't end up in that list. And for me, it's like, some of those are great solutions, but I'm trying to think about how we can solve this in a way that you don't just have that happen. You're not thinking about that because like you want to define your interface in a way that doesn't just start happening.
Yep.
Because you build a list page, then I can build the form and I'm messing up your list page. That should never happen. If you think about declarative programming, declarative interfaces, it should never happen. If we can be sufficiently expressive in how we're saying what this list is, and that's a problem, right? If you just do like a store.findAll and you render it in a list, you haven't actually given the app enough information, or you're thinking it's one thing and it's actually another thing. So
I mean, for me, it's always that. It's always I do store.findAll and then like a bug report comes in 2 days later. There's like this blank entry here.
Right.
It's because you added a new thing, then clicked cancel, and I didn't like clean up anything.
Right.
And, I didn't filter by as new.
Right. So the mental model is like store.findAll, and then I'm going to each model in my list view. And the mental model might be for a lot of people like, oh yeah, that makes a network request and then shows that result of that network request on the screen. But that's not true. That's not what you're actually putting in there from the API's perspective. So I wonder if it's almost like, we've talked about this before, how it's nice in a lot of Ember apps to decouple the loading from the movement through the app and the rendering. So right now you go straight from findAll that both loads and renders because it returns a pcall. But what if loading was always separate? What if the model hook did like a store.findAll or a loadAll, but that doesn't, when it comes time to render what's in the list, you have to be a little more explicit. And you have to say, you're thinking, am I rendering the universe of all models? Am I rendering a page of models? Am I rendering everything that's both on the client, that the client knows about and the server knows about? Should this just be the server? And I feel like we could figure out some good APIs that bring up that raise that question earlier in the development process. So that when you're starting development, you build a table page, and then you do findAll and you just render it. And then you add the modal form editing for new, and then you paginate it, and now you're having to redo the list page. I think you should never have to redo that if you're thinking about it. So
I kind of just like how this thought, like what if you had like helpers where it was like you load something in the model hook and then you do each, and there's a helper like all results from model hook, or like the universe of results from model hook. So there's keywords here that you can use to describe what the model hook loaded and then what you want to render based on that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, pcall is the right idea in a lot of ways. It's just that it's too implicit, and people have a hard time understanding. I mean, we do too. It's hard because pcall.
Wait, I don't like pcall
as a default return for findAll.
Yeah, correct.
So what should the default? I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, see, this is where I don't know, because you add a new thing on the client and you don't want to refresh that query. The new thing should just show up.
Right, unless you're on page 2 and what should it be if you're on page 2 of a table and someone creates something?
I think you add it to the list and you re-render the list.
And so if it's on page 2?
If it's on page 2, it gets inserted, everything gets shifted down by 1. If it's on page 3, there's no change to your page.
So then the declaration of what that list is actually rendering is, from the server's perspective, is page 2 from the server's perspective. And so it shouldn't be bound to client-side stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So you should put that as a programmer. Because if you put that and it was explicit enough, then no one could come and break your table.
Whenever I'm building a table, it's like I'm building a table to show someone these are all the records that exist.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is from the server's perspective.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would want something there.
Yes. But what if you're building Trello and you have a list of cards, you have 3 cards in the server, and then you click add, you want that new record to be there, even if it doesn't commit until you click off of it and it saves it. So in the Trello case, which is a list of cards,
I think I would.
You want every card that the client knows about.
Because
it's not the server's list.
So you're saying like Trello is an optimistic UI. As soon as you just click add, what you just want it displayed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. It could
be. But this is different. Like the pagination really changes this.
It really changes it. But it's also not just as easy as saying optimistic or pessimistic UI, because the table. Let's say you're on page 2, and let's say you have a total records up here, and you click add user, or add employee. That employee's not on page 2, so it shouldn't show in the current page, but it adds to the total.
Yep.
So you could be optimistic in that part of the UI, but maybe you just don't want to re-render the table because it's not doesn't make sense from the UI's perspective. Like the UX of that would be very confusing if you're like adding and then discarding, like the table shifting. So I feel like, anyways, I think there's lots of UI patterns here, and different apps call for different things. I think it should be brought to the fore more than it is. It should be thought about more deliberately than it is. So you're saying, yes, this is like the universe of everything I know about, or this should ignore client-side unsaved data.
Do you think that the answer here is just like more messages that to ask the store for things?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yes, part of it, absolutely. And we've talked about this when we've talked about like what it would look like to build Twitter in Ember, or the homepage, and like you have a query running in the background, but you don't want to push the latest data into the store, just have the whole app magically appear until someone says like load new tweets.
Yep.
But you want to show like new tweets available, which requires you to make the query.
I built this in Ember. I built this, and what I did is I made a second store, and I had the second store represent like the server. So anytime data changed on the server, it would pump over a WebSocket into
When
the
did
second
you build
store.
this?
This was like, I never merged it.
It was an experiment.
Yeah, it was like an action cable live query experiment.
Yes.
But the idea is that you would do like store dot.
You always have a server store that's as up to date as possible, whether you're pulling or WebSocket.
Now, you as a developer didn't have access to that store, but what you would do is you would do like store dot find all posts, and you get back like a many array of posts, and then you could do like that thing, like let's say model, you do like model.live, and that live accessor gave you access to like the posts in the news store. And this allowed you to build that Twitter UI where you could show like all the posts, and then up top it would be like model.live.length, and that would be all the live things.
And then you can do if that's different.
Yeah.
And they're not re-rendering the last query.
Exactly. And I had all these like helpers like new post.length, deleted, remove post.length. So it could figure out, like, it could basically take your current store and the live store and diff them, figure out what's new, what's been removed.
Sounds cool, dude.
Yeah.
You should publish it.
I mean, it was pure hacks.
Right.
And I had a method called flush that would take everything from the news store and put it into your current store, like your store main, your store service.
Right.
The way I had to communicate that over was basically to JSON, get all the payloads, and then push into the new store. So like serialize all the models in the live store, and then store.push into the main store. And that felt a little
kludgy.
Yeah. For basically like thousands of models. That's kind of brutal.
Yeah. And this is where, like, if we were building this from scratch, we would use, what's the term, linked list or whatever, where you can make a change to an array that's just basically the delta, but from the programming model's perspective, you have two arrays, but it's like a fork. It's cheap. It's cheap to make multiple instances of a store without having to serialize the entire thing.
Yeah, sure. I think a list where like you're always pushing on head.
Yeah.
So you're like appending to the list.
Like what is it? And doesn't Haskell do this?
So they do. Their lists you always append to the list. So like, let's say you have
if
a list with
clone or something.
Well, let's say you have a list with 3 items, right? And you have a pointer that's pointing at the head of that list. Let's call it like head 1. So it's like head 1, and then it's like 3 items, and then you can push a new.
You append or something.
Well, you prepend. So you take like new item, and you do new item.next equals head 1. So head 1 still has access to like 3 items, but this new item, there's now like 4 items on the list because its next thing is like your first item.
I see.
So like head 1 has no idea that someone else is pointing at it.
I see.
And then that's like a cheap way to make lists. But like there's something like, you need the language to be immutable here. otherwise changing like list 1 could affect list 2. So
and you break the contract.
Right.
But if we were building this in JavaScript, we would still have, if we wanted to make it so that from the programming model's perspective, you can just clone stores, let's say. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't need to duplicate the data.
Right. You want to make it cheap, yeah.
Right.
And I'm sure there's I feel like once you introduce relationships, this just gets super hard.
Yeah.
Like say you want to merge part of store 1 into store 2, do you pull along relationships with it?
Right.
I feel like these are not easy.
Rat's nest.
Yeah.
We talked about Orbit when we were having this conversation, which is basically approaching this from this perspective. Orbit in Ember Orbit is a big jump from Ember Data. It's just a completely new API, and most people are using Ember Data. So we were trying to think of ways in open source we could experiment doing this. And even if it's slow and not as efficient if it was built from the ground up, it would solve a very real problem for lots of people, because lots of people ask this question.
Yep.
So, in the past, when I had this problem, a big problem like this in an app, I took time to make the draftable model approach, which I originally got from Chris Selden, where you subclass a model, give it a new name, draftable post, and the cool thing about that is it inherits the relationships with the parent. And then you can mutate the draftable post and adjust its adapter so that it actually goes to your canonical URL. And when the response comes back, that's when you get a chance to push it into the original store, it's the original store, but you clone the model and push it into the original model. And that way the original model will update after the save, not before. And that works very well. It's just, again, cloning it or making a draft of it and bringing the relationships along is where it gets tricky. But I feel like there is an add-on there that takes the nice OOP interface of Ember Data, which I think is great.
I wasn't doubtful of that approach, but I was surprised at how well it worked, the draftable thing. I remember when you showed that to me, I was like, holy shit, this is amazing.
Yes.
So I definitely think there's an add-on here.
Right.
Especially if you're using JSON API, and you can kind of make a lot of assumptions about when JSON comes back from the server. I just, I know that it gets pushed into no, it's not that. It's when I'm writing this model to the server, I know what keys in the JSON payload I have to change.
Right. Yep. So maybe that'll be a fun new project.
Nice.
We take on eventually.
So, I've been doing a lot of Ember this week. I've been setting up our email, our email strategy. You're working on an email course now.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get all the tech in place for that.
Yeah.
So I've been setting up Drip, which is, what would you call it? It's like an email,
automations,
email,
workflow.
it's like email workflow. Yeah, exactly. Automations, lists, campaigns. It's sweet. It's awesome.
So it's when someone signs up for EmberMap and they get an invite to our Slack.
Yeah. That happens 24 hours after they sign up.
And we can customize that and all that stuff.
Yep. And then we can go in and we can see stats, and it's great. When you're coding these workflows, it's you're drag and dropping a flow chart.
Oh, cool.
It's if the user signed up and they have a paid account.
Oh, cool.
Invite them to this. If they don't have a paid account, we can send them an email that's hey, check out some of these free videos. There's this whole, it's flow chart decision tree.
Nice. And it's a visual tool.
It's a visual tool. And, just think about how much code this would be if you were to do this in Rails.
Yeah.
Just, there's all these rules. Once this happens, they drop out of this part of the tree, they end up over here.
I mean, just how much design you'd have to do from the OOP perspective to keep it something that you can maintain.
I'm always super skeptical of visual programming. Yeah, super skeptical.
You're doing it.
I know. Well, that's the thing I realized.
And you love it.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
So I think part of it comes down to just biting off a really small problem and building a tool for that problem. And then maybe as that tool evolves, it'll end up being a visual programming tool. But this whole idea of you've seen those UIs where it's drag and drop if statements and you don't need to know how to code to code. And you're do not let that anywhere near my code bases.
Right. I know. I mean, it's crazy. It's so true. Just because code is just so much to maintain. People are coding their own styles and choosing variable names. You think about that, and then you think about an organization that's been working on something for 4 years with 50 people. It's going to be all over the place. Whereas, like, you know, yeah, if you could have something much more constrained, it would be potentially way more maintainable.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, like, I was just going through this. I was like, wow, this is visual programming, and I love it. And I don't know what it was. Like, I think it's just because it's such a small, well-defined problem set.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was really impressed. I'm just really impressed with, this idea. I was like, I got this done in 2 days, and if I had done this in Rails, you'd see me in 2 years.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, also for the value proposition of that, for you to be able to recognize that even as an experienced Rails developer, is great. I was going to say, I think, for me, like, just my initial reaction there is like, the UI, the presentational components, like, there's no reason we need to be writing HTML for those. There's no reason we need to be writing CSS for those. I mean, we have a tool like Sketch.
Yep.
So if you have to make a button, feels like there's basically one way to do it. You use a button tag, you give it a background color, you give it a border maybe, you give it a box shadow maybe, you give it text. You get to choose the size of all that stuff and the padding. And feels like you should be able to go into Sketch, something like Sketch, made for the web, and drag a button over and just make it how you want it to look, and that's it. Like, you're not coding anything. I mean, the question is, like, why do we code it? And I guess HTML, you need that.
Well, I can tell you why I don't do it in Sketch. It's because I feel like it's duplicated work.
Right. Exactly.
And so that's why I code it, is because that's, I guess, you have to.
Right. You have to anyways. Why would you make more work for yourselves? But if you could attach event handlers in Sketch.
I mean, even
Microsoft tools do this already. You double click on a button and then you just go the code behind or whatever, and then you just write a function handler.
I'm not even worried about event handlers right now. Like, if I could do the visual stuff just to get me started.
Right.
And then, I guess there's always refactoring. So I would never want to be like coding into.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if you could encapsulate all that stuff behind like a class that you don't manage or something. And then if you want to edit it, you just go to Sketch.
Yeah.
But I do think it's ridiculous.
We're slowly getting back to like that visual style programming that I feel like I might hate.
Yeah,
it just scares me. So.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about a constrained part of it, but the behavior and the visual stuff is linked in a way that it feels like it's a hard problem to tackle if you don't get both of it. So if you can abstract away the visual side into like a Sketch tool, but you haven't done anything for the JavaScript or behavioral side, then it feels like you're kind of stuck. And you're going to be in that duplication land, right? Mm-hmm. Except for the code behind idea with like Visual Studio and all that stuff.
Interesting. So you would say that like for this tool to really be successful, this like visual component maker, you would need some way of handling events.
I guess
like
so.
Or to surface that.
Or just something. I mean, I'm just saying, like, as Ember developers, like, we're attaching events to DOM elements. So if we all of a sudden lose access to the DOM elements, now we have to, this thing either has to figure that out or we're going to be duplicating work.
Yeah. I mean, maybe some of the constraints here are just like, this thing only works with like these like pure data down, actions up, presentational components.
Right.
And you just have like a few events that, you can call, but you get like the...
I mean, we're basically talking about abstractions, but like you could abstract those into like a library or a visual tool.
Yeah.
The visual tool, the fact what you're talking about, the reason I like it and the reason I think it works well is because it's a logical structure that is constrained. So it becomes impossible in this design tool to define an impossible workflow, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you say, if the user is subscribed, do this, else do this, there's no way in Drip to say, all of a sudden both happen. Because the tool, you just drag it to one or the other, right?
Yep.
It's a decision tree. Whereas in code, you can mess that stuff up all the time, right? You can create bad states in your code all the time, but in this tool, they're eliminating that because it's constrained, right? Mm-hmm. Just like Scratch or whatever the visual tool for programming is, where the kids just drag the blocks together. It's very constrained. You can't break it in the same way you can break code that you're typing in. So what I was just thinking is, what would it look like if you still built all your pages for your app with HTML and CSS, but when it comes to the flows, you would use a tool for the flows. So instead of writing transition to or link to anywhere you want, you actually pull all the screens in, and then you use like a state machine and like a visual tree to define every possible state in your app.
Yeah. I
Too much?
I feel like you would have like, once you have a nav bar that's on like every single page, and every single page can get to every other page.
Well, you don't have to define the extent of each flow. You would just, it was the same thing like in the link, you would say, link to
It's kind of like
admin.
outlets. What outlets can link to other outlets? I
Right,
guess.
exactly. No, it's just like you have admin in the header, and you say, instead of typing link to, you would pull it up in this tool, and you would create a link from it to a page. But it's visual in the sense that you could, if this tool knew all of the links, think about what it could show you. It could show you the flows through your application and constrain how you define those flows, or basically transitions from one state to the next, so that you don't get into the kind of trouble you do when you're just doing this stuff anywhere.
That's it. Showing me the flows in the application is like, that's one of the things we struggle with.
Totally.
Like, just keep adding pages.
Yeah, and all of a sudden it's end by end by end,
Yeah.
and it's crazy. So you could be at a page, and then this thing could show you every possible next step, and you could define next steps. But again, I think it's better, because the reason I think it's better than doing it in code is because this tool could offer you constrained ways of doing it. So let's say you're doing a wizard, and you have these 4 screens, and then you just say it's only legal to go from screen 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. That way you can never go from screen 1 to 3. Whereas maybe if you're doing it with like URLs and link to and transition to, there's a possible way to do it with like the back button or something.
yeah.
Right? Or just changing the URL. But if this thing were in control, then it would be impossible. So that's how I think a tool like this could actually help in that area. Even though people, I'm sure, if someone was listening to this and they were like, this is ridiculous, I'm just going to write link to, I'm going to write transition to in my action. Like, why would I just like load this into a visual tool and like drag a link from one page to the next? But I think the way it would make it so that it actually becomes worth it is something like this, where you can define certain, you can impose constraints on it that you can't in code.
Yeah.
So just like the drip case,
Right.
where you can say, this is a tree, and this is literally all the possible states, and there's no way to go from this part way down here back up to the root or something like that.
I mean, I've definitely built forms like this.
Yeah.
Where this would be super helpful.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's part of it. Yeah, and that's part of the behavior too. Like if you had the visual stuff, and that was that's partly behavior, the state machine. I mean, it's not like, maybe that is it, right? Because before we were saying if you could define the visual pages in like a tool like Sketch, and then wire up the stuff in code, but maybe you just built every page. I mean, this is like what Framer and all these things are trying to do, right? You build every page, and then you define the transitions and links between them, and that's your app. Except you have like lots of other concerns, like data persistence or whatever. But in terms of like the state machine aspect, which I think is one of the hardest, I do feel like there is a place here for that kind of tool to help.
yeah.
We'll see what we come up with. So we want to answer some questions now. We asked folks on Twitter and Slack to write in some questions. We got some. There's like a lot of people talking about like people wanting more sleep. We got multiple people talking to us about this.
It's funny because I would like to know the answer to this as well. I actually got a pretty good night's sleep last night.
Yeah?
But not the rest of this week.
Yeah. For me, it varies. Sometimes I am a very regular sleeper, and sometimes I just am all over the place. We got a question. Larislav on Twitter asked about authorization, not authentication techniques. Okay. So first of all, what is authentication and what is authorization?
So authentication is you are who you say you are. Authorization is you can do what you say you can do.
So it's verifying you are Ryan Toronto, So
that's authentication.
That's authentication. So you come to the front of the building and you show your badge, and I say, yep, that matches up because your picture looks like this person. And then the authorization is access. So like once you try to go to level 3 security and you do your badge, it's not a question of are you Ryan? The question is, does Ryan have access to level 3?
Yep. So how do we do that in Ember? I think in the Ember side, we kind of like define these roles. We have a authorization service, and the authorization service says like, are you an admin? Are you an editor? Are you XYZ? And that thing can figure out what permissions the current user has. And then a lot of times I have a before model hook, and so in like the kind of like the parent route, like in the admin route or the editor route or whatever route, I just have a before model, and I do if current user or if authorization is admin, like let them through, else transition to the home page.
Right.
So that's kind of how I do it on the Ember side. I think with like Ember being a client side app and sort of everyone having access to the source code just by loading the app, I just have like these little guards that kind of get sprinkled out in the router or in the routes. But on the Rails side, where it's like about data persistence, that's where I'm more careful is the wrong word. That's where I'm more like
it's more important.
Yeah. Yes.
Because it's changing.
And we use Pundit, which is a Rails gem that basically gives you like a declarative interface for you have a model, you have a class, it's like a post, then you have an instance of that class, so like an actual post, and a current user. And it gives you a bunch of methods like can edit or like update ? And you can return true or false, show ? True or false.
Right.
And that's where we define like, can the user see this? Can the user see this instance of the model? Can the user see like all models of this type?
Right. But at a high level, the idea is an array of roles. Right. That's better than trying to stuff it all into one notion.
Yes.
So you're an admin or not, you're a subscriber or not, and those that you can be both an admin and a subscriber, and anything else you end up adding down the road.
Right. Whenever I'm asking, like, does a user have access to this? I'm never like inspecting attributes of the user.
Sam has access. Ryan has access. Tim doesn't have access.
Yeah. It's always just a simple message to that user, like, are you an admin? Yes or no.
Right.
And inside that, logic can be buried inside there.
Right.
It's like, do they have a paid account? Did they do this? Did they do that? You can compose all that in there. But yeah, from like the outside, there's always a simple question. Yeah. Do you have access to level 3?
Right.
Like that's
Right. And then there's some issues that you can run into with doing like before model, make sure you're an admin. Again, as you said, all the code is on the client, so it's not about guarding people from the code. It's just about like the right user experience and making sure the app works the way you expect. And the problem with the before model stuff is the rideshare problem, which is a server-generated state change. So if you're an admin and you're in the admin and then
you get fired.
But your app is open on your computer and you haven't made another network request. Okay, let's say you had a WebSocket or something like that. So now admin is false, or roles don't include admin. But that before model hook's not going to run. It's already run.
Yep.
So what do you do there?
So, what do I do? What do I do?
Yeah.
Like in this situation, I don't do anything. When the person tries to send data to the server always checks before it writes data. So it would not allow that data to go through.
It would come back as a 404, and then you could have a global handler.
401 or 403, whatever.
Right.
That.
And then you could come back and say, if I ever do 401, show a modal that says you're not authenticated, like reload the app or something like that.
Now, I think what you should do, not what I do, but what you should do is, what we talked about with Alex.
With Alex.
Constraint router.
Right.
And there's like
a root.
Some event happens that causes you to move out of this tree into another tree.
Right.
I guess you could have like the... in this app I work on, we use like JWT tokens, and they expire every 30 minutes. But we have like a refresh token endpoint because people use the app for longer than 30 minutes.
Right.
So if refresh fails or you don't refresh, then like there will be a polling service that when it tries to refresh it, that fails. Since that failed, it's going to transition you Now it doesn't transition you like up to a root. It just transitions you to like a you've been logged out page.
Right.
Click here to reload and log in again.
Right.
So,
but yeah, it's not a holistic. Yeah, there's still room for a holistic kind of well thought through solution for all Ember apps.
Yep, 100%. Definitely though, like I don't worry about as much on the client, and then on the server, just verify everything before I rewrite.
Right.
And I think most, if you're using Rails, most server frameworks are going to nudge you in that direction.
Right.
So
right.
You're in good hands with those.
Right. So, okay, just to recap on the client, it's going to be basically you're writing your own service. And the way we do current user is that's a service as well.
Yep.
It also has a user model because you usually want the user model and you want any relationships that hang off the user. But there's a separate service that controls the authentication state and the authorization state of the user, the current user. That's probably loaded on when the app loads up.
Yep.
And that way, like any component can get that information just by injecting the current user service or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, cool. We also had someone on our EmberMap Slack ask about improving the developer experience. We're working with Ember Data.
Yeah. One of the things I recently did in the past few months is Ember Data models have this idea of like an is error. So if you like try to save a model and let's say the backend 500s, you would have like this computed property. You did like post.get is error and it would return true. There's also this idea of like is invalid, which is like if the backend, you try to save a post, the backend 422s, let's just say like, your title was too long. Mm-hmm. You've reached the maximum number of characters. Mm-hmm. Please shorten it. That 422 will put your model in an is invalid state. So it won't be an error. It'll be is invalid. You can kind of imagine like there's this whole matrix of like when invalid and not error, when error, invalid, when valid and not error, like all these things. And I noticed in like template code, it's really hard to think about all that.
Right. So
one thing I did is in our adapter, if the backend responds with an error, any error, just
any 4x or 5x.
Yeah, 4 or 5x, I stuff the Ajax response onto the model, and then I have a thing, I trigger like server error, is server error, and that will be true. There'll be a property is server error, that will be true, and then you'll have access to what came back.
So that leaves the rendering up to like the templates where you and how you want to display different errors.
Yeah, and I look at it like if my backend 422s or 500s, whatever it is, I'm going to be displaying an error message.
Right.
Now, the contents of that error message is going to be different.
Right.
But yeah, so I found this really helpful. Like just putting the server errors onto the model kind of it lets you like play with them in code.
Right. Remove a little bit of the magic, the implicit stuff.
Yeah,
with some of the default behavior from DSL model.
Exactly. And then my templates, I just have if is server error. And then if it is like a 422, I can display those nice validation messages.
Yep.
Otherwise, I can say like, okay, if something went wrong, contact us at support and we'll help you out.
Right.
So yeah, I found that super helpful, and it was just a couple lines in the adapter.
That's cool.
The Ember Data adapters are great for kind of like peeling back the magic stuff.
Right.
But then you can also still have the magic. So
right.
It's great. It's best of both worlds.
Totally. When it comes to like data and like querying data, I mean, we using JSON API and Rails in the back end with JSON API resources, like it's usually pretty easy to get a graph of data, and I don't find myself wanting or reaching for like a tool to display that. We also use Mirage, so that I feel like that helps helps us move fast on the data side of things, where it's like I'm going to make sure the page has the data I need and I'm querying the right stuff and the relationships are right and being updated. So I think that's part of it as well. And the data tab in the Ember Inspector is super useful. I'm trying to think of.
I mean, sync relationships.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing. Like when we on consulting work that we do, and places where we see folks confused a lot of time, is the async relationship stuff is really confusing.
And I'll just reiterate this, but async sync relationships don't mean you can't lazy load.
Right.
Sync relationships just mean when you call, model.get relationship, it always returns what it knows about the relationship.
Right.
So I think you can still use async. You can still use the idea of async relationships where you're lazily fetching data. Don't fetch the post comments until I, scroll to the bottom of the page.
Right.
That's totally doable. But just, making async false, I think, just makes Ember Data so much easier.
Right. I'm trying to think, because we sent an email like last year about what are your biggest Ember Data issues. I'm trying to remember some of the things that folks said about Ember Data. Were we working on some videos or...
I think we were doing some...
Just
we were
some
doing a Mirage video.
Yeah.
Modeling.
Modeling is always something that...
Yeah. I think this is where the Mirage stuff is really helpful.
Yeah.
I will build everything in Mirage first, and I notice that as I'm building it in Mirage, it becomes much more clear what I'm actually trying to build.
Right.
Like not only the relationships, I feel like I have a pretty good idea of the relationships, but just the naming of things. I feel like Mirage it's really, really cheap way to figure out what you're about to do. I know you just said this. So.
No, yeah, totally. I'm just trying to remember what other people were saying about Ember Data. I mean, I think probably also a lot of times, like, we work on relatively new apps and control the back end. So if you're working on an app that's 5 or 6 years old before JSON API existed, and maybe you're running into all sorts of stuff with naming conventions and relationship conventions not being the same everywhere. And there's been some projects we've worked on with from the consulting aspect where making little sandboxes to reproduce that data in Mirage or just be able to understand how my app loads data apart from the UI. We've done that in the past.
Yep.
And that's really nice. Like even just calling JSON stringify, and you can pass in as a second and third arguments of JSON stringify, you pass an object and you can pass in like a separator and like a space value, and you can get it to pretty print, and you put it in like pre-tags. I've done this with Mirage a ton because people are like asking questions about their Mirage response and you just want to see the data. And that's a great way to just understand that, because I feel like a lot of people maybe are working in Ember and don't have as deep server experience, and the data loading stuff is at the root of the current problem that they're facing, but they don't have the experience to dig down into it. And when it comes to like JSON and relationships and stuff, that's kind of where their knowledge, like they usually hand it off. But like if that's the root problem, it can be worth it to invest in making some of those tools or just views of the data to make it easier.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think the best way to learn this stuff is by building it.
Yeah.
Once you actually are forced to define all these relationships with like a relational database, and you see how that then represents itself in the API, and then how that shows up in the client.
Yeah.
Especially with like, in the relational DB, you're gonna have join records, but that's not always true between the server and the client.
Right.
You can just expose like the many to many side of it.
Right, exactly.
I think that's the best way to learn. I remember when I learned this stuff in PHP, I was just like, oh wow, you can model like everything with has many, belongs to, and many to many. It's just like, wow, that like just forcing myself to think in those terms just unlocked a lot. So.
Yes, totally. Like, and it's like you said, like just building it when we did the new homepage for EmberMap, we talked about that domain model for like 4 hours. You end up with like a bookshelf and a bookshelfable polymorphic relationship. It can be a series or it can be a new collection. Collection can be a heterogeneous collection of different items like videos or blog posts or series even. So those have like items, and many things are itemizable, and but that gives you like this really flexible structure, and now you can kind of bookshelf a series, you can bookshelf a collection. It's really nice. And if you haven't done a bunch of domain modeling, you're not going to come up with that. But like you come up with it and you realize it's just like, yeah, that's right, that's the correct modeling here, and it never gets in our way, and like loading data is no problem. That could be some good videos, actually, I think. You take it, and something way simpler than that, where you're just taking this thing and it's like, yeah, that's a many-to-many, or there's a join record there. It's not always obvious. I mean, there's lots of times we change it while we're building a feature. Tons of times.
But this is why I like Mirage.
Yeah.
Because the cost of changing it is so cheap. I mean, it's way cheaper. Like in Rails, you're like, oh man, I gotta like undo
Edit
that
a migration,
Yeah.
right?
I gotta roll back, edit it, roll forward, and
Right.
like you're just like, it's easy, but there's just a lot. There's
Yeah,
just
it's totally boilerplate stuff.
By the way, I've said this before, but I do everything in Mirage first.
Yeah.
Like when I go to write the Rails stuff, I'm just looking at the Mirage diffs.
Yeah, the diff. And you're just applying it,
Yeah.
which almost makes you feel like you should never even have to write those anymore.
100%.
Yeah.
You should not have to write backends anymore.
Yeah. Cool. The last question was from Bill, Pixel Handler, and he was talking about when can we get TypeScript into Mirage, which I do think would be a fun experiment. We were talking about doing some Mirage work tomorrow, maybe live streaming it. I'd like to get some of the bugs cleaned up and ship at 1.0. I've been saying that for a few months, but it would be cool to have TypeScript in there. Imagine like just always knowing whether you're dealing with a collection or an array of like return from a factory. Sometimes that's different. What's on a model, relationships, stuff like that would be really cool. And also I just think it would improve the code because of the code base of Mirage itself. I mean, it's just like there's a ton of stuff there. It's all made up. Mostly by me.
You think TypeScript would nudge you?
Yeah, there's model or collection all over the place, and I don't know what's being passed in here. I mean, I did my best, but it's just, so it would help because, like, would TypeScript help me in an Ember app? I mean, okay, maybe, but mostly I'm like wiring Ember's primitives together that are very well designed and tested. When I'm making Mirage, it's like you're starting with nothing. You're just using classes and stuff. So helping define the interface and making those explicit would be awesome, I think.
Yeah.
And improve the DX for people who use TypeScript. Auto-completes, you're on a
'cause you would
collection,
have the
schema.where, and you're just doing dot first, and you just know all that stuff. So that'd be awesome.
Nice.
So we'll see.
Cool.
Cool. If people, I'm going to ask you this question again. Let's see if you do better than last week. If people want to ask us questions on the podcast, where should they go?
React.js. Let's see. We've got Topic EmberMap on Ember Community Slack. We've got EmberMap inside EmberMap, which is a Slack for EmberMap subscribers. If you subscribe, you should definitely join that.
Yep.
And then we have at Ember_map on Twitter. And if you know anyone that works at Twitter and you know how we can get rid of that underscore, please reach out to us.
And one day, the way you'll ask us questions will be to go to...
No, we're not going to announce anything.
EmberMap.com/podcast.
But that's not ready.
And click a button that says ask a question.
We're not
maybe if we announce it
things.
and we say that's going to be there next week, it actually will magically appear on our website.
Guarantee you it won't.
Thank you so much for joining us this week. And again, be sure to ask us questions if you have any. We'll see you around the community and talk to you next week. Bye.